Farmers Valley Art Center in Avon, and for more than 2 decades I had a studio space at the Colt building in Hartford, while it was still raw space and somewhat industrial studio space. While you're familiar with Ned and his history there, he and I have an association with the neighbors at the Colt building occupying studio space. I first moved into the Colt Firearms Factory in, I want to say, 1990, and survived through one eviction and a second eviction with the transition of the property and the new ownership, where a lot of the studio space is now apartment dwellings rather than industrial workspace. And what was really nice about the property at the time in my career as a clay artist, I was able to work and live within the unit to develop my career and line of work for traveling the country, exhibiting at fine art and craft festivals throughout the East Coast and out toward Colorado. I left the Colt building in 2005, 2006, and at the time I had already been in a house in New Britain, very close to the Rockets and the B Stadium, south side of town, and I've been operating a ceramic studio at the Art League of New Britain for more than 5 past years recently. And I welcome for all of you to visit the Art League. We offer many opportunities for artists, painters, photographers, ceramics, sculptors to participate in our exhibits with the juried venue as well as the open call for members. I'm also on the board of directors of the Art League, where we're preserving the facility, which was originally built in 1870 and established as an arts organization in 1927. It's actually a old carriage house that operated carriage services to some of the affluent residents in the region. If you haven't been over to New Britain, very close to the New Britain Museum of American Art. I live on the south side of town, so it's really easy to be nearby with having close accessibility to the studio, and I offer hand building and wheel throwing sessions through the Art League on Mondays and Wednesday evenings. So I encourage you to visit the studio, even choose to participate if you have the interest. We generally run an 8-week program where people enroll for a block of time to have a full dose of experiences with clay in both wheel throwing, hand building, sculpting, and glazing. Today I have a few samples of my work that were created there at the facility, as well as within one of my artists in residences up in Newfoundland back in 2015 and 2017. I had the opportunity to work with the English Harbor Art Center in Trinity Bay in Newfoundland over 2 summers, working within a ceramic studio primarily in porcelain. And I don't have a lot of examples of the work from the residency, most of which is in my studio, although this is a piece that was created here in the States in 2015, soon after I returned from the residency in English Harbor. And I have some raku fire tiles that were actually made in Newfoundland and then returned here to the States to be fired in the raku firing process. Raku is a very unique firing technique dating back to the 16th century of the Orient, where the work is removed from the kiln while it's red hot and molten, and reduced very quickly in temperature in chambers such as pits, ditches, and barrels contained with raw materials such as pine needles, hay, sawdust, anything that's left to burn very quickly and easily, with the piece being relatively hot in its temperature. Typically, raku fired work is fired to about 1900 degrees, which is considered mid-range firings in ceramics.
So in the process of taking a hot piece from the kiln in its molten state and putting it into a reduction environment such as a chamber or a pit with burning matter, the piece goes through a very unique firing, including charring and smoking. As a matter of fact, when you see raw clay that's unglazed, it appears smoked black because of the density of the fire within the closed chamber. The fire is considered a post-reduction firing, if you're familiar with ceramics at all. There are what are considered oxidation firings, which are electric-fired kilns and in-studio firings. Primarily, many schools and institutions work with oxidation firings because it's an easy electric technique, whereas other reduction firings using gas and wood are primarily more environmentally hazardous and usually offered in outdoor facilities, such as barns or loft studio spaces, that sort of thing. I typically fire oxidation in the studio in New Britain, and my reduction firings are done on my property outdoors at my residence. You can actually visit some video footage of my work on my website. I have a card here that offers you information to direct you to all the vehicles of my exhibiting my work through the internet. Not only do I carry my work physically to events such as fine art festivals and craft festivals, but I also represent my artwork online via a few websites, one of which is actually my home base website is stepstothetemple.com, and my Etsy sales page for one of my market lines is considered Primitive Clayworks. All very much like these pieces here, more archaic, like distressed works that looks like it's from another place in time. A lot of my history in my ceramic work has been to kind of fool the viewing of the work by it appearing very old and somewhat archival in its appearance. And again, these masks are examples of how clay has been hand sculpted and fired in the raku technique. These cups are hand built, where they're embossed with textures of clay and then glazed in an oxidation firing. These are literally constructed from slabs. It's a demonstration I have to share with the group today, as well as some pinching that I can do, where pinching can be manifesting sculptural or figurative works such as animals or talismans. Sometimes clay artists refer to fetish American Indian wares as sculptural pinching techniques and exercises. I did also notice within the studio there's a number of dolls representing different cultures. Clay in its history has also been used in porcelain and stoneware sculpting for doll ornamentation, for understanding cultural backgrounds and narrative storytelling within the specific culture's ability to carry out history and remark on generational influences from years to years to years. And it's really nice to be in the company of some unique Native American dolls, as well as it looks like European and even English. The Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford has an amazing, extensive collection of ceramics works. Much of it is on display, and I highly encourage frequent visits because of the constant rotation they have within their archives and what it's like to be influenced by ceramics for it being not only a primitive means of working and utilitarian, but also decorative in how a lot of the wares within museums are highly coveted for their longevity of life over centuries. And a lot of what I like to do when I'm working with individuals is to have people experience the clay itself by passing it among everyone. You're welcome to actually sit and use the clay as I'm discussing some of my techniques. This is a stoneware. Feel free to manipulate the clay and use it in a manner that you're instinctual. I find that in my work and my experiences working at all levels of interest and all ages, we are intuitive in our own explorations and being creative, and there are many ways that we also choose to explore working three-dimensionally and sculpturally, very different from drawing and painting. Although I do have a long history of actually using surfaces of clay as a painterly medium. I have a few examples on the table of how I'll be starting from clay that's been texturized with just the side edges of these ware boards. I literally took the group of ware boards as a stack and used the side edges of the boards to generate texture and detail within the surface that eventually will be sculpted. With my history of doing drawing and painting over the years, in addition to clay work, I have a history of doing linoleum block cutting and printing. This specific piece is titled Shadow Walker. It's a image inspired by a cell phone photo along a walk with the dog I had at one time. So you can see the hard shadow of the canine creature off to the left, whereas the figure and the leash are literally the subject of the photo from the sun's zenith in the winter time frame. Again, this is a linoleum cut-based block print. This particular monoprint has been a number of layers in the execution, where I'm realizing that this might be at least 3 passes through the press. But it's another departure to how I explore myself with my creative pursuits in both drawing and painting in the process of also doing work in clay. Welcome. In regard to the printing that I've done with the linoleum, I've also used that linoleum block as a embossing to clay. This is actually a clay tile that has been painted with underglaze as well as embossing it with the linoleum panel, which was used to print on paper. So the clay itself is soft and permeable to accept the print and the pressure from applying the linoleum to the clay, while the plate itself had been treated with underglazes to help delineate color values in the composition. I've done a number of prints in clay that have derived from linoleum as well as wood, and I find it fascinating to go between printing on paper and printing in clay, because not only are you working with a two-dimensional format on paper, you're actually creating more of a three-dimensional format by working with a thicker membrane such as clay. So if you take a close look at some of what has occurred in this print, in addition to the linoleum, there's actually foliage, leaves, and embossing that's been added to the print for an additional element of composition. This is again fired in the raku process, where it's reached about 1900 degrees in a gas-fired kiln, and then removed from the kiln while it's red hot and molten, and put into a barrel with oak leaves, pine needles, hay, sometimes seaweed, anything that burns quickly for quick reduction of temperature with direct fire and smoke.
When you say molten, when I think of molten, I think of like
glass being molten.
Running things.
Right. So the surface is actually glazed with glass, and that's the area that's molten. So it's sometimes glaze that moves in the process of moving your ceramic piece, but the ceramic is actually a stone-like structure. The clay itself does not become soft and flexible. It actually remains hard in the firing, but the surface, coated with glaze, actually has a molten, tacky quality because of how the glaze melts at different temperatures. And I primarily mentioned that we fire at a mid-range cone 6, cone 06 to cone 6, which is anywhere from 1900 to 2100 degrees. And there are times where you go in with tongs, you reach in to grab, perhaps a vessel or a slab, and there are times that the tongs themselves leave marks in the surface of the glaze, which in turn can be very interesting texture and character to the surface. Again, it's designed to fire work very quickly, and it has a very crude, almost archival quality to it because of the smoke markings. And has anyone seen a video footage of a raku firing? It's a very unique process. I do have some visuals on my website of the actual pulling process, as well as works that are stacked in a kiln chamber, and I highly encourage doing a little bit of research with that, because as much as I can talk about it in a conference room like this, there's much more fascination to actually seeing the act of fire itself, where your protected gear, such as helmet, mask, and gloves, is very important, because you're literally working with a furnace or a kiln, much like a glass blowing artist has the close proximity to molten glass. That's a fascinating thing about clay and glaze, where a lot of us realize that clay in its wet plastic state can be molded into any form. Primarily within utilitarian pursuits, you can create platters and cups and bowls and chambers for cooking within. Whereas in decorative ceramics, you become more appreciative to individuals and how they can sculpt with clay and have very expressive means of pursuing either figurative work or portrait work, or even mosaic-like work in tiles. There's so many avenues of clay to pursue. I particularly like to pursue utilitarian wares. I have found that in my career as an artist and the success of my sustaining myself as an artist, the ability to sell a mug or a bowl as kitchenware and the regular use is creating a household name for myself within how each of my works are signed and dated, as well as created within series, sometimes limited edition color palettes or techniques. And again, my website represents a lot of some of the examples of what I've done. What was very exciting about being involved in Newfoundland in 2015 and 2017 was working at an organization that used a church as its performance facility and its gallery space, as well as its education studio space. And I was very involved with the daily activities of people coming and going as visitors, as well as people attending the concerts on a weekly basis, and the church itself being rented for ceremonies for weddings and parties. And what was very interesting about being so far away in the Maritime Islands of Canada is your modern conveniences aren't as close or as easily attainable within proximity. And I can remember after one of the large events that occurred toward a few weeks into my residency, I was responsible for finding a place to get rid of all of these liquor and wine and beer bottles. And a lot of the locals were mentioning that you would just bring them to the landfill and they would be discarded without redemption. And it's very different from how we are here in the States, being environmentally conscious about the refuse. And I found it interesting that all of this glass was an ideal resource in using in my wares for glazing. So I started melting a lot of the glass into the porcelain work to create very interesting thick crackled surfaces of glass fused to clay. And I found it fascinating because I have been working in clay more than 30 years now. And I could have done that here in the States in my studio in Hartford, but it took me all this time away for being more environmentally aware and being kind of secluded without much going on around me to kind of invent this unique little process of using colored glass in among glaze. And again, the website that I have to share visuals is a great resource for taking a look at some of that work. Did you have a question?
Do you have a symbol you have?
I don't, but I do have a few images via our ability to tap into iCloud storage from that residency, and I'm happy to have you scroll through the photographs.
Why I asked that is because my grandmother used to have vases of crackled glass, and I tried to research where to get that today, and they used to be special people who make glass vases of crackled glass, and the artists don't do it anymore.
No, it's a very, well, I think what I have found in fascination in working with more depths and higher concentrations of glass content, that there's what's considered a coefficient factor. It's the firing range of when glass melts and when it cools. In glass itself has very different ranges within different types of glass, depending on the molecular or the chemical makeup of the glass itself. And when you start to think about how kilns are fired and how ceramic goes from a plastic wet state to a fired brick state, there's an expansion of what happens within clay, as well as a contraction in the cooling process to create your stone-like quality. In glass, it's very much the same, where in you're heating the glass and it becoming molten and soft in its elevation of rising heat, is it reaches a certain point when it becomes fluid, and then for it to become stabilized and an object that would have form, such as a glass cup or a vase, or even a sheet panel like we have in the cases, the amount of time and necessity to pay close attention to that chemical coefficient factor of when glass cools to become hard, there's a very narrow threshold of how the speed of cooling needs to occur so that the work does not become crackled. Whereas when something cools very fast, it creates in fractured-like tendencies. And here's an example of multiple colors together that give you those fissures of crackled glass. So what occurs with melting glass on the surface of the clay is almost like a translucent skin, different from glaze. And another thing I'd like to remark on, I want to show you some more of the imagery from the Newfoundland wares.
So you place a different colored glass purposely on the surface?
Yes, and I had very limited colors to work with. I had brown, green, and clear. Just the basic wine bottles and beer bottles. But because I was working with cobalt glazes and glazes that contained copper, I was able to stretch the range of that. And hey there, Ned.
Sorry about that.
I have a few photos of the wares from English Harbor that are here somewhere. Bear with me. So this is just a series of thumbnails that I can show you. In some cases there was glaze applied to the rim, more to the interiors. I worked on a small scale with it being porcelain, did a series of beadwork. Here's an example of some of the glass work I've done within. Beautiful. No, it's actually the copper elements in the glaze composition. Hello. So there's a relatively simple palette of color that was used in the series of works. And here again, oops, I'm sorry. Here again are some of the masks that were derived from some of the carved brownstones in the cemeteries. So this is actually a relief from some of the carved brownstones.
Pushed into it?
Yes.
Or pushed over it?
Actually, a mold was created from the stone itself,
Oh, okay.
and then these pieces are pressed from the mold.
Okay.
So some of the things that we wanted to share with everyone is how you would create a vessel from a sheet of clay.
Or no?
And I did pass around some clay for people to do a little bit with. You're welcome to share that with everyone. I have more clay here to...
What did you want us to do with it?
You can pinch and create anything that you wish. I thought it would be important for everyone to experience just a little bit of hands-on. I'm going to cut some of this for the rest of the group. This is much softer and more malleable, whereas the clay that's been distributed before, I'll take that. Anyone interested in some very soft clay? You're welcome to. Not a problem, you can put that right on the table in front of you if you like. You'll see that some of this is much softer.
I played
sure?
with it plenty of times.
Sure.
Thank you.
One of the things that I like to do when I'm getting warmed up in my studio is to give my digits and my palms a little exercise by rolling clay into a ball. Very elementary technique in creating vessels or bowls is pinching. So once your clay is in its sphere form and compressed, using your thumbs and forefingers and a spinning technique with pinching your forefingers with your thumbs, you can start to create vessel formations, pinched vessels, pinch pots.
Kathy loves this flavor.
Clay is a wonderfully soothing medium for sculpting. There is a very interesting tactile experience. Some find it unique to remain messy. Others only create under messy conditions.
What are you?
I go back and forth between wanting to be dirty but always having to wash my hands. I like when clay doesn't necessarily stick to your hands. I don't like the buildup of clay in my hands, although I listen to myself saying that where I sit at a potter's wheel and I'm constantly covered with slip and wet and raw clay. And what's really nice about that opportunity is the fact that you can use water, sponges, and the ability to clean up with a towel. I thought I had a towel here. Thank you for noticing that. So a lot of times when I'm working in my studio, I'll have a towel over my leg by my bench to actually assist with keeping clean. For many years I ran sessions out of my studio at the Colt building, and as I mentioned earlier, we have operating workspace at the Art League of New Britain. I also work for the Southington Community Cultural Arts Center, SILCA. It's a new arts organization in Southington where I'm primarily involved with a group of people with intellectual and physical disabilities, and we have a wonderful Access Art program to work within drawing, painting, ceramics, and fiber. I did bring a number of figurative examples to the table to show you how we can start to sculpt and form different shapes. As you can see, I've closed this vessel, so now it's hollow on the inside, and I can start to sculpt animals by using different pinching. You can also use tools to cut through clay. Sometimes it's easier just to use your hands and move the clay around in a manner that going after a canine sitting position. And generally when you have clay that's nice and soft and permeable, you're able to sculpt in a manner that let this sit for a little while and come back to it.
Let it sit to dry out a little bit.
It does help, although one thing I like to do when I'm working in a studio is have a few projects going at once, and sometimes when the clay has reached its limitations for how much you can push it and it doesn't hold its form, it's a good idea to let it sit to firm up and air dry a little before you go back to.
Like the watercolor.
Very similar, yes. How some mediums have a resting place. Oops. Paper. You can see how this is beginning to look figurative. Again, there are a number of different tools to work with that are beneficial in a clay studio. Typically, an artist will use a pen tool, wood knives for sculpting. I like to incorporate things like chopsticks. forks, kitchen tools, and even kitchen spatulas, so that you're expanding beyond what's sold specifically as clay tools for. And many artists will use textures and elements of nature, such as like ropes from the beach. There are artists that use manhole covers to print and emboss texture in clay. Some people use natural rock walls and bark for interesting surfaces. Again, I used something very quick and easy with not having much textures here to work with, but the side edge of the wearboard to create this diamond pattern on the sheet of clay. Typically I work from templates in my studio when I'm building forms such as a cup. And as you can see, I have prepped some of this clay by pre-cutting it to get started. It's been sitting on paper for a good half an hour to firm up. When we join clay, we use a score and slip technique by putting some tooth into the surface, using either a pin tool or a fork or any type of pointed instrument. Slip is also beneficial. In this case, I'm using just water and applying wet areas where I'm going to be joining the clay. You can see there is clay that's building up on my hands. Sometimes that's beneficial to have to work with in molding. Yeah, right. It is very similar to wood crafts in how things are connected. Typically I'll use my pinching technique to help smooth any rough edges, all while the clay is wet. Tapping techniques will help the clay bond. You can even use the length of a tool to help blend your clay on the inside.
Do you order a certain name of clay, or do you mix?
I work with clay that is mined and milled in Sheffield, Mass. This clay that I have rolled out into slabs is a formula specifically for raku. You can see there's a granule quality to it, which has a fired grog. That helps with the ceramic refractory capacity of the clay and its expansion and contraction while firing, especially doing something like a shock firing, such as raku. It helps keep the clay bonded together. The clay that I passed out as a second sample, much softer that you were working with, does not have grog in it. It's a lot like porcelain. It's a smooth body, so you can see the variation between the grog in the clay here versus just very smooth clay without grog. So these are two different formulas for different wear. A lot of times a sculptor who would think about large constructions or pieces that might withstand being outdoors in winter cold months,
Right.
subject to freezing, would use a clay that has a lot more tooth, much like a brick clay. Whereas something as a fine clay, such as a porcelain or a stoneware without the grog, is more for utilitarian wear, porcelain bowl, porcelain dolls, porcelain beads, more refined surfaces. Actually, porcelain is a great clay for how the glaze becomes supple on the work. I'm going to pass this bowl around so you can each feel it, and I want you to each treat yourself to a little bit of chocolate bark that I brought in for each of you to enjoy. But you can see how the clay body itself has a very smooth texture to it, and the results of how the glaze is fixed and fit to the clay is a more buttery kind of character, where this being stoneware this has a little different clay glaze result on it, but you can see there's more grain to the cup. So pass that cup around also, and people can see the difference with. Softer clays have the ability to stretch a little further. Because the clay is much more malleable, so I can go very, very thin in sculpting and creating ware that might be more fragile. Everyone get a chance to take a look at how the ware? I'll come around and grab the rest of that. Did you get a chance to see?
Have you ever worked with sculpting?
I have, yes, and it's actually very interesting because when we think about the plastic clays, the polymer clays, they bake at a much lower temperature, much like cookie dough bakes. And there are situations where you can actually burn the clay and burn the color out of the clay if you're using a gas oven or a temperature higher than required for the baking process. But it's equally satisfying to work with polymer clays. Generally, they're designed for smaller pieces because of how the clay is sold in smaller blocks. Full range of colors. You can marbleize the clay really nicely, and you can also paint polymer clays. And some people use it for jewelry, some people use it for ornaments, utilitarian wares. But it's a very different type of clay in its technique and result. This is actually raw clay, earthware clay. And we come back to our cup demonstration to put some closure into the base of the cup. So before I actually cover the bottom, I'm going to make sure that all the seams are connected and secure. You can also use sponges to clean the surface of the clay up if you have an excessive amount of slip. I'd like to know if any of you have had any experiences working with clay.
Yes, I took it in school.
Good.
And we had to be very careful not to explode it.
Good, a few of you, yeah. What were some of your experiences that you recall?
Well, I remember the teacher saying to get all your bubbles.
Yes.
But mine always exploded.
Yes. No, I think one of the most difficult things about understanding clay and its fragility is you really can't trap air inside of clay because as it fires, the air wants to escape the clay through expansion and can literally blow a piece apart or create kind of callus-like surfaces where it would have a bubble in it and break apart. So that's why you want to pay close attention to your seams to make sure everything is compressed.
I met somebody once who had a piece that was his prize piece, and it blew up in the kiln, and no, next to somebody, he blew up and destroyed his piece. That's what it was.
The nature of problems in a firing can, it's a whole book of woes.
Yeah.
I have a very interesting experience that I have not encountered in my career, and I've been working in clay since the early 80s, where inside a kiln, you have all this kiln furniture that stacks between wares. So if we can envision multiple shelves between each other, each shelf has ware on it, and then there are posts to hold each shelf up.
Oh.
I recently opened a kiln in a firing where the post had fallen out from underneath a shelf, so the interior of the kiln had fused together a number of pieces. It was a little bit to explain. But that was the fault of the post, because the post actually split apart, and in the structure of the shelf sitting on top of the post, it didn't have enough support for it to hold it, and it literally fell in from underneath the shelf and ended up becoming a faulty firing. Some of you had mentioned an early need for departure. It's coming up on 3 o'clock. Thank you for being here with us. It was a treat to be in company and share with you some of my experiences with clay.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you in the forward future.
And I
Here's
look
a
forward to
card.
seeing you on the,
Yeah.
on there.
Here's a card for visiting my website.
Thank you.
That's for you. Anyone else is welcome to take that. So what I'm doing here for this cylinder is I'm creating a base.
Mary. How's Matt doing? I heard he had a... That was that eye. What's your percentage of hand building and not?
I have been doing a lot of hand building over recent years, and I've also been wheel throwing, so it's generally 50-50.
Okay.
Can you tell us how you first discovered the clay as a medium? And
Yes, I had a long history of working with clay, where my first demonstrations were in middle school in Newington, pursuing industrial arts within the John Wallace Middle School. It was a Votech school early in its day, where we had industrial arts, home economics, and fine arts, including clay. And a lot of my extracurricular activities were encouraged to participate in after-school programming, and I first became interested in clay within the industrial arts departments also using plastics and wood in school curriculum. Throughout my career in early education, I was painting a lot of murals. I began in 5th grade in elementary school with painting murals and after-school programming, as well as vaulted ceiling murals in high school. I actually moved from Newington to East Granby in my junior year of high school and was very involved in sports and arts within a large school system in Newington. And when I moved to East Granby, I went from a school body of 400 per class to 70 per class. So I found myself saturated in the arts because of no pool, no hockey rink. You know, our resources at school were very different. So I became very involved with in art programs in high school, like painting murals and working on the yearbook and pursuing computer programming, actually, in high school. In college, pursued liberal arts and studied at UConn, and also became certified in floral design at the American Floral Arts Academy in Chicago. And at the time, being very involved with a commercial florist, I was very excited about creating vessels for floral display and plant function. So I began pursuing clay work at the Art Guild of Farmington in the early 80s. I want to say the earliest dates I have signed work are probably 1981, 1982. And I wasn't encouraged to date my work until like 1983, 1984, when I had aunts and uncles asking for my work and saying, where's your name, where's your signature, where's your date? Because obviously now here I am 55 and I've had a long career of working in clay, and it's kind of nice to see the evolution, you know, from what was to what is now. A lot of what I've done in some of my alkalines with clay have been involved with repairing a roof in the city of Hartford, Wickham Park, the north end of Hartford, with an artist named Chris Giacone, who ran a studio in the north end. She and I built a number of terracotta roof tiles for the front entrance to the park, if anyone's familiar with that area in the Windsor-Wilson area. I've also done a lot of mosaic tile work for floors and backsplashes for commercial installations with residences. I think my most curious pursuit in recent years was the residency in English Harbor, pursuing glass fusing with clay, because it was very experimental with that. A lot of what I do in the studios for getting others involved is to demonstrate utilitarian wares, such as I have for you with these cylinder objects. Again, I work from a template. I usually emboss the clay ahead of time so that there's already a membrane of texture within the surface. And once the clay has become firm and it's able to hold its form without flopping or sagging, that's when I start building. Again, a scoring technique to join the clay wherever the clay becomes in contact with one another. What you're doing is creating a tooth so that your clay ends up fitting together. So not only do I have the hand building techniques for demonstration, but we also work with potter's wheels and slab rollers and extruders to create ware with different machinery.
Because I think of the furniture here.
It's very similar to dovetail. A little bit of compression helps bond the clay.
It's kind of interesting when you were going with fire pieces there that you use the composition of needles and leaves. That's mulching and composting.
A little bit, yes.
I see
It's
that.
primarily dry matter. I don't use wet leaves or green leaves. I'll wait, like a lot of times when I'll prepare the matter for a firing, I like to use autumn leaves that have fallen from the tree, so they've already dehydrated, pine needles that are exfoliated from trees, and any kind of dry matter, because anytime that there's moisture within the fiber content of the burning matter, it creates a very caustic or thick smoke. A lot of times very hazardous, because not only are you having carbon burn off within the matter, but it can sometimes be vaporous with moisture being burning off. So that's why I use dry matter in the reduction for raku. What's very interesting is to use dried seaweed, because the seagrasses and sea kelp, anything that's soaked in salt, you have very interesting results in how the lusters will burn into metallic tones. So a lot of times you'll achieve gold-like or bronze-like results from salts. And my favorite is dried oak leaves and dried sycamore leaves, because the leaf themselves are dense. But if you were, like, a lot of times a sycamore will start to shed early in the season, and a lot of times it will shed its bark. And barks are more dense in their composition, so you don't want to use something so thick. You want a fire to burn very rapidly, very quick. So a lot of times shredded paper is good. The pine needles. Some artists will use wood shavings from wood shops. You know, the artists that turn wood, they can collect their sawdust from their tools and use that as a dry matter. But it is a lot like composting.
Yeah, because I'm trying to do gardening, and I noticed if you use wood chips and use that composition, you get a nice garden. That's why I'm telling you about artwork. I didn't know, see how everything interties.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. I have also used wood ash in glaze formulation. So when you think about what goes into formulating the glaze, it's primarily glass, ground glass, ground clays, so that it has a little bit of a body, and ground metals, which would offer color. So cobalt would bring you blues and dark blacks. Coppers would generate greens, sometimes reds. Irons would produce browns and reds. Magnesiums would be more blacks and grays. Nickel, again, green. So a lot of the raw materials that painters use in their manufacturing of paint are the same materials that ceramic artists use in glazes. And glazes are generally dry chemical compositions that are soaked clay, mixing them with dry ingredients like you would mix bread dough, and then soaking the dough in water to create a liquid glaze, and that's how glaze is applied to clay. It can be either poured over the work, it can be dipped into the work, or brushed over the surface. So it's very similar to baking in a kitchen. Right, so this is a wet surface to help bond the clay, act as an adhesive.
I'm glad to see what using that kind of brush, because I think this is for cooking, can I use a brush like that?
Oh, yeah. It's my favorite place to go and find tools for the studio is Java. You know,
Jim, can you tell us, how do you mix your glazes? How do you do all your own glazes?
yes, I have a long history of working with glaze formulation. Most of the glazes that I work with in my studio are hand mixed, so I work with the raw materials and weigh them out per gram, primarily in 4,000 to 8,000 gram weight buckets. So a lot of people would remember how Home Depot sells their orange 5-gallon buckets. That's about 8,000 grams of glaze. So I mix it in large bucket quantities so that it can be used in the studio. And there are a number of glaze formulas that are published for artists to use and modify and test with. The glaze range for temperature firings that I work with in my studio are mid-range +6 glazes. And they're primarily formulated for oxidation firing, electric kiln firings. I also use commercial glazes. A lot of times you can achieve vibrant colors from glazes that you can purchase at ceramic suppliers, such as reds, purples, pinks, oranges, and it's much easier to buy glazes in that color palette than to actually hand mix them. Generally, when you start investing in raw materials, you're buying materials in the 50 to 100 pound quantity. So it's a lot easier and resourceful to just buy a small pint of glaze in various colors through ceramic suppliers. I was just up at Sheffield this week getting a new bag of clay, a new batch of clay, so that we have lots to work with in the studio. A lot of the clay is mined in the region and then milled and cleaned and worked through sieves and glaze clay formulation. And there are a number of different clays that are available in the region. Some white, mostly browns and reds, because generally raw clays from this region are containing iron,
Yeah,
red
right.
iron. So they're primarily beige when they're fired, or red. Most white clays come from the Orient, porcelains, but there are white veins of clay in this area too.
You ever go out looking for your own clay?
I have. There's been a number of clay veins in Truro, Mass. When there are dune slides, you can get clay from all over the world, really. Primarily from riverbanks and shorelines. What's really nice about being up at the National Seashore, when you're hanging out on the beach in the summer and you look at the dunes, you see all those beautiful reds and browns and beiges in the dunes, and they're naturally just eroding from hills. And in 2016, I don't know if anyone recalls, but there was a pretty major dune slide in North Truro, Mass, with one of the summer storms that had caused a dune to slide. So there was about 35,000 square feet of dunes that had literally moved from a hill toward the ocean. So when that was all unearthed, you were able to pick clay directly right out of the earth. Now, it's in pure clay. It's very rough and granular when you're working with it because it does contain sand. And then when it's fired, it's very bubbly and porous. So a lot of times what you want to do if you're searching for clay and natural resources is you want to dry it out, grind it down, push it through sieves, weigh it, and do, I want to say studies or tests by firing different thicknesses, firing at different ranges. You keep an entire log of what your results are with each temperature formulation or each density experience with how thick the clay is. And that's how people will generate their studio work, through numbers of tests. What was your question?
How can you tell it's clay when you're in the environment?
Well, it generally has a body to stick together. You know, a lot of times when you pick earth up off the backyard or the side of a sidewalk, there's no real bonding agent to it. Typically, you'll find clays near bodies of water, where earth is saturated to a point where it's literally holding water. As long as your clay can be bonded and not fall apart, then you can work with it. It can be molded.
I'm always doing gardening, so that's why you have to be your water on clay.
In the cylinder, and you can add handles, more texture, appendages. What I like to do is ensure that all seams are compressed both inside and out. So with wood tools and brushes, I'll pass this around so you can feel how the piece is still flexible.